The courtroom buzzed with an unspoken tension, a heavy charge that seemed to settle into the very fabric of the room. It was the kind of atmosphere that made even the most seasoned of attorneys look over their shoulders, and the judge, typically composed, sat uncomfortably at his bench. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. All eyes were on one person, Emma Reeve, a woman who told the crowd she had been isolated from her best friend for as long. Emma stood at the center of the storm, the weight of her decision visible in every tight-lipped breath she took. Her face, a mixture of terror and resolve, was a stark contrast to the once innocent girl who had admired her father as a hero. Now, she was a woman on the verge of revealing something that could unravel the very foundation of her family's life. The courtroom was still, so still it felt as though time itself had frozen. The audience, once lively with chatter, now sat in stunned silence, the tension palpable in their widened eyes and stiffened postures. Lawyers glanced nervously at each other, exchanging uncertain looks. The judge, whose patience had weathered countless high-preference cases, appeared visibly shaken, his gavel in hand but his mind elsewhere. Everyone knew something monumental was about to happen, but none of them were prepared for the revelation that was about to tear the fabric of their world apart. And then there was David Reeve, her father, once the town's shining example of success, a businessman with a spotless reputation, now sitting in the dock, sweating under the unforgiving scrutiny of his daughter's gaze. His clenched fists were white-knuckled, his face pale, but it wasn't just fear that emanated from him, it was guilt. The mask he had so carefully constructed over decades of lies was slipping, cracking at the edges. Emma didn't flinch. Her eyes never left him as she took a steadying breath, a moment of stillness before the storm. She knew this wasn't just about exposing her father's dark secrets. It was about something bigger, a truth buried so deep that it threatened to shatter everything, and she was ready to expose it. The room held its breath as she finally spoke, her voice steady but raw with emotion. "My dad is lying," she declared, her words ringing out with the force of a thunderclap. "And I'm here to expose the truth." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The courtroom, which had been a picture of tense anticipation, erupted into stunned silence. For a moment no one moved, no one blinked. Time seemed to slow down. What had she said? The words didn't seem real. Couldn't be real. Emma Reeve, the girl who had always been her father's protector, now accusing him in front of everyone? The room was suspended in disbelief, the magnitude of her statement settling like a weight on their chests. David's face drained of color, his trembling hands betraying the lie he had spent years weaving. His eyes flickered in panic, darting from person to person as if searching for a way out. Any way out, but there was none. The truth had been unleashed, and there was no going back. A ripple of gasps swept through the room, the crowd whispering in disbelief, unsure of whether this was some sort of twisted joke. But Emma didn't falter. She stood taller, her jaw set with unwavering determination. "I'm not here to protect him anymore," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I'm here to make sure you all know what he's really done, the lives he's destroyed, the lies he's lived. You deserve to know the truth." The shock waves of her words hit David like a punch to the gut. His entire world, his reputation, his family, his power, was crumbling before him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The reality of his situation was settling in, and it was more terrifying than any enemy he had ever faced. Emma's eyes never left him, her gaze unyielding, as if daring him to deny the inevitable. Her accusation was the spark that would ignite the firestorm, the beginning of the end for the man who had once been untouchable. The room, once silent, now buzzed with frantic whispers, as the truth took root and began to spread like wildfire. But Emma wasn't done. She had only just begun. "He's been hiding the truth for years," she said, her voice now laced with a mix of fury and resolve. "The people who vanished, the families torn apart, the pain he's caused. He's the reason why. And today, I'm making sure you all know what he's really capable of." As her words echoed through the courtroom, it was clear. The walls of deception were coming down. There was no turning back. The battle for the truth had begun, and Emma wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone her father had hurt. The room, once full of uncertainty and disbelief, was now a battlefield. Emma had set the stage, and the war for the truth was only just starting. This is the calm before the storm, and in that silence, the world held its breath, waiting to see if Emma could take down the man who had once been her hero, or if the truth would be buried once more. Before the story continues, pause for a moment, kindly hit the like and subscribe button. Every week, we dive into stories of justice, betrayal, and redemption, where nothing is ever as it seems. Make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Now, let's get back to the story. The courtroom was thick with tension, an invisible weight that pressed on everyone present. The usual hum of hushed voices was replaced by a suffocating silence, the air heavy with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. Emma Reeves stood at the center of it all, her eyes unwavering, her posture strong but betraying a silent storm brewing inside her. She was no longer the little girl who had once idolized her father, no longer the daughter who saw only his strengths, his unwavering devotion. Now she was a young woman, hardened by the brutal truths she had uncovered, and today she would bring it all to light. The moment shifted, pulling the audience back into her memories. She was a child again, watching her father walk through the door after another long day of work. The world had felt simple then, safe and whole. David Reeve was everything to her, the pillar of their home, a hero in her eyes. He was the protector, the man who could solve any problem with a calm smile and a steady hand. She'd rushed to him, eager for his embrace, her small hands wrapping around his leg as he laughed softly, lifting her up into his arms. "Welcome home, champ," he'd said, and everything felt right. He was untouchable, invincible. But now, in this very room, the weight of everything Emma had come to learn was suffocating. Her heart raced in her chest, but her gaze never wavered from her father, her childhood hero, now the accused, his once perfect reputation shattered by the monstrous truth hidden beneath the surface. The criminal syndicate, the lies, the betrayal. It was all coming to light. The moment transited, pulling back to the present. Emma stood tall, but the toll of what she was about to say was visible in her eyes. The entire courtroom was fixated on her, on this daughter about to tear down the man she had once called her protector. Emma knew the truth now. She couldn't unsee it, couldn't ignore it. The realization settled like a stone in her stomach, its weight threatening to pull her down, but she held firm. "Your Honor," Emma began, her voice trembling slightly at first but gaining strength with every word. "I didn't know what my father was hiding from me when I was young. I didn't understand it then, but I understand now. My father is not the man you think he is. He's been involved in a criminal syndicate, and I'm here to expose it." The words landed like a bomb in the courtroom. The gasps that followed were nearly deafening. Emma stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. For a moment the world around her seemed to blur, the shock of her revelation hanging in the air like a heavy fog. David's hand gripped the edge of the witness stand, his knuckles white, his face pale. The man who had once commanded respect, who had been untouchable in this very room, was now a man cornered by his own daughter. The shame on his face was unmistakable, his carefully constructed mask of control slipping away under the weight of the truth. The weight of Emma's eyes. The moment shifted again, a flash of memory cutting through the present. A young Emma, unknowingly following her father as he met shady figures in dimly lit alleyways, her footsteps light and quiet as she trailed behind him, not understanding the significance of the transactions unfolding before her. She saw him exchange briefcases with men in suits, their faces unreadable, their voices low and urgent, but it was the man in the dark corner of the warehouse that caught her eye. A tall figure, his hand gripping a gun. Emma didn't know it then, but her father's world was one of violence and deceit. The sound of the courtroom door snapping shut pulled her back to the present, and the weight of it hit her like a physical blow. Her father had been involved in these things, and worse. The faces in her memory twisted with the knowledge of what her father had really been doing while she sat in the safety of their home, unaware. "I'm not here to protect him anymore," Emma continued, her voice now steady and firm. "I'm here to make sure you know what he's really done. The lives he's ruined, the people he's hurt. He's been hiding the truth from all of you, from all of us, for years. And today, I'll make sure the truth comes out." David's eyes flashed with panic, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. He wanted to defend himself, but he knew that Emma's words were a direct hit. The courtroom shifted, the intensity of the situation building. Emma's courage wasn't just about exposing her father's lies, it was about exposing everything that had been buried for too long. Cut to a flashback, the scene dark and fast-paced. Emma, still young, was hidden behind a stack of crates in an abandoned warehouse, her small body pressed against the cold concrete as she peered through a gap, watching her father speak to a shadowy figure. The man handed over a large envelope, which her father took with trembling hands. It was all done in silence, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Then the explosion. Swift, violent. A shot rang out, a body hitting the floor with a thud. Emma gasped, her heart nearly stopping. Her father had been a part of this world, this dark, dangerous world. He had pulled her into it without her knowing, manipulating her love for him to keep the truth buried. Back in the courtroom, Emma's gaze never left her father's face. His face, pale with fear, showed the cracks in his once impenetrable facade. But Emma's determination was unwavering. Before the whispers could spread through the courtroom, Emma's voice rang out again, sharp and cutting through the chaos. "The people who've gone missing, the families torn apart. He's the reason why. He's been working with the syndicate, and today, you will all know what he's really capable of." The courtroom erupted. Whispers turned into a cacophony of disbelief, accusations flying in every direction. But Emma was a force of nature now, unstoppable. She wasn't done. Her father may have been the mastermind behind the syndicate, but she was the one who would tear it down. The lies, the manipulation, it all ended today. She stepped forward, her eyes still locked on David. She could feel the heat of the moment, the tension, the anger. She could feel the weight of everything crashing down on her. But she couldn't stop now, no matter the cost. The truth had to be told, and she would be the one to tell it. The tension in the courtroom escalated with each passing second as Emma's testimony continued to unearth the truth about her father's dark dealings. But as the courtroom listened in rapt attention, Emma's mind drifted back to the moments that had shaped her understanding of the criminal world her father was entangled in. The moment shifted, plunging Emma's thoughts back to the past, where her father's double life had begun to surface. As she spoke, the courtroom disappeared, replaced by a whirlwind of fast-paced, action-filled flashbacks. In the first flashback, the scene was set in a dimly lit alleyway, the air thick with smoke and shadows. David stood at the center, his eyes darting nervously, waiting for the exchange to happen. He was no longer the respected businessman everyone knew. Here, in the underbelly of the city, he was a player, part of something far darker. Emma, barely old enough to understand the true nature of what she was witnessing, followed him silently from the shadows. She crept closer, her small footsteps barely audible, hiding behind a stack of crates. From her vantage point, she could see the men her father was meeting, scruffy, hardened individuals with cold eyes that spoke volumes of their dangerous dealing. They passed over a briefcase filled with money, the handshake that followed sealing the deal in silence. Emma's young eyes widened, confused but too terrified to ask questions. She had no idea that the world she once saw as safe and secure was, in fact, a facade built on lies. The moment transited, showing another flashback. This time, the setting was even darker. The echo of hurried footsteps bounced off the cold concrete walls of an abandoned warehouse. The door creaked open, revealing her father and a shadowy figure inside. Emma watched from behind a stack of boxes, her heart pounding in her chest. Her father was speaking in low tones, his voice tense. Emma could barely make out the words, but it was clear that the conversation wasn't about business or family matters. They exchanged something more dangerous. Illegal weapons, crates of high-grade firearms, the kind that belonged in the hands of criminals, not businessmen. Suddenly, a sound from behind caused Emma to flinch, but her father didn't hear it. She froze, her breathing shallow, as he turned toward the back exit of the warehouse. She instinctively followed him, keeping her distance, her heart racing. Cut back to the present, the courtroom was still, and the weight of the flashbacks hung in the air. Emma could feel the eyes of everyone on her. The evidence was clear in her mind, even if she didn't have it all in her hands yet. She knew the truth. She had seen it with her own eyes. Her father had been caught up in something far more sinister than any of them had imagined. The moment shifted again, and Emma's frustration boiled over. She had spent years trying to suppress the truth, trying to ignore the reality of what she had seen, but no more. The tension in the courtroom was thick as she stepped forward, her voice rising with emotion. "You lied to me, Dad!" Emma shouted, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "You dragged me into this world of crime and deceit, and now I have to clean up your mess. Do you even realize the lives you've ruined? The pain you've caused?" David's face twisted with panic, his body tense, as if he were about to crack under the pressure. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands trembled visibly as he searched the room for an escape. His once impressive demeanor was gone. In its place was a broken man, cornered by the very truth he had tried so hard to bury. But just as the moment reached its peak, an explosion of sound cut through the silence. Gunshots. The sharp, deafening crack of multiple rounds fired in quick succession rang out, making everyone jump in their seats. The lights flickered violently, casting shadows that twisted like monsters across the walls. Suddenly, the courtroom doors burst open, and a group of men in suits stormed in, their movements swift and deliberate. At the front of the group was a masked figure, his face hidden, but his presence undeniable. He raised a gun into the air and fired a shot that echoed through the room. "You're not getting away with this," the masked figure yelled, his voice deep and menacing. The room erupted into chaos. People screamed, ducking under tables, diving for cover as the masked men moved swiftly through the courtroom, their guns drawn, their intent clear. Nothing would stop them from silencing Emma, from stopping the truth from coming to light. Emma's heart raced as she realized what was happening. These men weren't here for her father. They were here for her. The syndicate had sent them, and they weren't leaving without a fight. She snapped back to her senses in an instant. Without thinking, her body moved instinctively, her training kicking in. She ducked behind a nearby desk, her hand going to the concealed knife at her waist. She wasn't the helpless girl she used to be. Her father's involvement in this dark world had taught her to fight, to survive. The moment transited, showing Emma in a blur of motion, her body shifting, leaping out from behind cover, her knife flashing through the air as one of the attackers lunged at her. She twisted his wrist, the sound of bones snapping under her strength as she disarmed him. She wasn't about to let them stop her now, not after everything she had fought for. The courtroom was in full chaos, but Emma's resolve only grew. She looked back at her father, who was desperately trying to find a way out. The fear on his face was palpable, but Emma couldn't afford to save him now. She had to protect herself and expose the truth, no matter the cost. She moved again, dodging another attacker, flipping over a table with agility that surprised even herself. The sound of gunfire and screams filled the room as Emma fought her way through the chaos, determined to survive this fight. As she faced down another group of attackers, the realization hit her. This wasn't just about exposing her father's crimes anymore. This was about staying alive long enough to make sure the truth reached the world. The stakes had just risen, and Emma wasn't about to back. The courtroom was still, its tension mounting as Emma's voice echoed through the room. The walls, once calm and composed, seemed to close in around her as her mind began to race, trying to piece together the jigsaw puzzle she had been missing all this time. Everything she had believed about her father's involvement in the syndicate started to crack. Something didn't add up. It wasn't just him. It was something much darker, much more dangerous. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt, and the truth she had been blind to was suddenly glaring at her. The moment shifted, and Emma's thoughts flashed back to a time when she had overheard her father's cryptic phone calls, the hushed, urgent conversations she had dismissed as nothing more than stress from work. But now, with everything unfolding in the courtroom, those conversations took on a much darker meaning. Her father hadn't been calling the shots. He had been the one receiving orders. Her pulse quickened as the pieces clicked into place, and a new understanding flooded her mind. Her father wasn't the mastermind. He was a pawn, trapped in a web spun by someone far more powerful than he could ever imagine. Cut to a flashback, Emma's mind hurled her back to a meeting she had unwittingly witnessed years ago. She was a child, hiding behind a stack of boxes in an office her father frequented. The door had been slightly ajar and she couldn't help but eavesdrop. Inside, her father stood facing a man whose face was hidden in the shadows. The room was suffocating with tension, the quiet hum of a fan barely breaking the silence. "You understand what's at stake, Reeve." The voice came out low, controlled, like someone used to giving orders. Emma had never heard this man before, but something about his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "You do this, and your life stays intact. You cross me, and everything you love, everything you've worked for, will be gone. Do you understand?" David's voice trembled as he responded. "I have no choice. I'll do whatever you say. Just don't hurt my family." Emma watched, her eyes wide with disbelief as her father bowed to the will of the man in the shadows, a man she would later learn had far more influence than she could ever imagine. The truth was undeniable. Her father had been a puppet, tied to a higher power, a police officer who had long since sold his soul to the criminal syndicate. The man pulling the strings wasn't just a businessman, wasn't just a criminal. It was a figurehead, someone in a uniform, someone she never would have suspected. The moment returned to the courtroom. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the truth finally fully settled in her mind. It wasn't just a conspiracy, it was systemic. The corrupt officer, someone so deeply entrenched in law enforcement, had been controlling everything. Her father had been manipulated into a life of crime, a pawn used to cover up the actions of those far more dangerous than he ever realized. Emma's mind raced, the urgency building. She wasn't the only one in danger now. If the truth came out, it would tear down more than just her father's life. It would expose the rot at the very core of the system, and that was something they couldn't let happen. Her eyes flicked back to her father. His face was pale, sweat dripping from his forehead, his hands trembling as he desperately searched for an escape. But it was too late. The truth had already come to light, and now Emma was determined to make sure it reached the world. "I'm not here to protect him anymore," Emma said, her voice now steady, stronger than it had ever been. "I'm here to expose the truth." Before she could speak further, the door to the courtroom slammed open with a force that rattled the entire room. The audience gasped in shock, and everyone turned to look as a group of masked men in suits flooded into the room. The sound of their boots clicking on the floor reverberated through the silence, the intensity palpable. At the front of the group was a towering figure, his face obscured by a dark hood. "You're getting too close to the truth, girl," the masked figure growled, his voice cold and menacing. "This ends now." Emma's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't falter. Her mind had already shifted into survival mode. These men weren't just here to intimidate, they were here to silence her, to prevent the truth from getting out. But Emma wasn't going down without a fight. Without thinking, she moved. Her body flowed into action, instinct guiding her. One of the attackers lunged toward her with a gun, but Emma was faster. She sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the barrel of the weapon as it missed her by inches. She rolled forward, her legs launching her into a backflip that landed her directly behind the masked man. Before he could react, Emma grabbed his wrist and twisted, using his momentum to send him crashing into a nearby desk. The room erupted into chaos as the attackers fired into the air, causing the already panicked crowd to scatter. Emma didn't waste time. She saw another man advancing toward her, his gun drawn, his movements precise and calculated. But Emma wasn't about to let him dictate the pace of the fight. She was faster, more agile. She ducked low, avoiding a shot that grazed her shoulder, and spun behind a nearby pillar for cover. Her mind was racing, but her body was calm. The sound of gunfire echoed around her as she peeked around the pillar, her eyes scanning the room for her next move. A sudden movement caught her eye, a figure darting toward her, their hand outstretched with a knife aimed at her throat. Emma barely had time to react. She grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it violently as she threw him over her shoulder. The knife flew from his hand, embedding itself into the wooden floor with a satisfying thud. The fight wasn't over. She could hear the heavy footsteps of more attackers coming toward her, their weapons drawn, but Emma was ready. She took a deep breath and charged forward, her body a blur of motion as she launched herself into another series of flips and acrobatic moves, dodging bullets and knives in a display of grace and agility. She was no longer just defending herself, she was attacking, taking back control. The courtroom was no longer a place for justice. It had turned into a battlefield. Gunshots rang out, the sound deafening as the battle raged on. Emma didn't hesitate, didn't back down. The truth had already been exposed, and now she would make sure it stayed that way. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for everyone who had been caught in the web of corruption. As the final attacker fell to the ground, Emma stood in the center of the room, panting, her muscles aching from the fight. The masked figure who had led the assault lay unconscious at her feet, and the rest of the attackers were either down or retreating. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. But there was no time to celebrate. The courtroom, once filled with the tension of a family's unraveling truth, erupted into total chaos. The explosion of gunfire rang out like a thunderclap, echoing through the walls as mercenaries stormed the room, their weapons drawn, their faces cold and relentless. The syndicate had made their move. Emma's testimony had become too dangerous to ignore. They had come to silence her, and they would stop at nothing to ensure she never spoke again. The moment shifted as Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The shock of the ambush caught everyone off guard. The judge's gavel slammed down in vain, calling for order that would never come. The gunmen moved like shadows, their boots pounding against the floor as they spread out, weapons raised, searching for their target. Emma and her father were caught in the middle of it all, and there was no time to think, only to act. Without hesitation, Emma's body sprang into motion, her instincts honed by the danger she had been living in for years. She ducked low, narrowly avoiding a spray of bullets that tore through the air, shredding the wooden furniture around her. Her hand shot out, grabbing a chair and throwing it at the nearest gunman. The chair slammed into the mercenary's chest, knocking him back just long enough for Emma to sprint forward, her muscles taut, her focus razor-sharp. She tackled one of the attackers with surprising force, her body moving in a fluid blur as she twisted his arm behind his back in a perfect armbar. His grunt of pain was cut short as Emma slammed him to the ground, pinning him with her knee, securing the hold and rendering him helpless. In a single, swift motion, she stripped him of his weapon, kicking it across the room before moving on to the next threat. Behind her, Emma heard her father's strained voice. "Emma, we need to get out of here." She turned, just in time to see David Reeves stumble as a bullet struck his arm. His face contorted in pain, but he gritted his teeth and tried to remain steady. Blood seeped from the wound, staining his shirt, but Emma didn't hesitate. She rushed to his side, her heart hammering in her chest. "Come on, Dad," she urged, pulling him up with surprising strength. The action had slowed for a brief moment, but the mercenaries were regrouping, closing in from all sides. There was no time to lose. The chaos intensified around them, gunfire and shouts filling the air. A nearby table splintered as a bullet tore through it, but Emma and her father ducked just in time, the shrapnel grazing the edges of her clothes. She hoisted him up, ignoring the panic that was creeping into her chest. The back door was their only chance. "Through the back door, Dad, now!" Emma shouted. She grabbed her father's arm, pulling him through the labyrinth of overturned tables and debris. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the sharp tang of sweat. But Emma wasn't about to let this be the end. They made their way through the back of the courtroom, dodging more bullets as they sprinted toward the emergency exit. The heavy sound of boots echoed behind them. Mercenaries were closing in fast, but Emma wasn't about to let them catch them. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning for any way to fight back. They had no choice but to push forward. With a sharp yank, Emma wrenched the emergency exit open, the door groaning on its hinges as they dashed into the narrow hallway beyond. The moment shifted again as they entered the courthouse tunnels, a dimly lit network of corridors that wound beneath the building. The sound of their footsteps echoed against the cold stone walls. a haunting reminder that they weren't safe yet. "Keep moving," Emma said through gritted teeth, her voice steady despite the storm of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She glanced back one last time to make sure they weren't being followed. The mercenaries were gaining ground, but she wasn't about to let them corner her, not after everything she had fought for. The moment exploded again, as distant explosions shook the walls of the tunnel, rattling the earth beneath their feet. The sound of a grenade echoed through the distance, the blast reverberating off the stone, making the walls tremble. The mercenaries had set charges, trying to block off the only escape route they had. But Emma was ahead of them. She had anticipated this. With a sharp turn, they sprinted deeper into the tunnels, their footsteps echoing in the dark. Emma's hand was firm on her father's arm as she pulled him along, never slowing down, always staying one step ahead. Her mind raced with calculations. They couldn't keep running forever. There had to be a way out. Gunshots rang out behind them as the mercenaries closed in. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she heard the unmistakable click of a silenced weapon. She spun, drawing her father behind the corner just in time to avoid the incoming fire. The bullets whizzed past them, ricocheting off the stone walls as they scrambled for cover. They couldn't stay in the tunnels for long. They needed to find an exit, and fast. Emma's pulse raced, her thoughts working in overdrive. The courthouse was still under siege, and every step they took was one closer to their goal. But Emma knew they weren't safe yet. They had to find the right exit, the one that would take them out into the open, where they could disappear. She stopped suddenly, pulling her father to a halt. "This way," she whispered, her voice low but determined. She led him toward a hidden staircase at the end of the tunnel. The steps creaked underfoot, but they were steady, and they led to an unmarked exit. They were nearly there. Behind them, the sounds of gunfire were growing fainter, but the explosions continued to shake the earth. They were running out of time. Emma reached for the door at the end of the stairwell, her fingers wrapping around the cold metal handle. She hesitated for only a moment before she wrenched it open, the blast of fresh air hitting them like a wave. The street outside was empty, the area eerily quiet. They were out. But the war was far from over. The moment they slipped through the hidden exit of the courthouse and into the cold, dark night, Emma and her father didn't feel safe, not by a long shot. The chaos of the courtroom attack still echoed in their minds, the sound of gunfire, the heat of the mercenaries' pursuit, the overwhelming realization that their fight was far from over. They had escaped the immediate danger, but the real battle was still ahead of them. They moved through back alleys, their footsteps quick and purposeful, weaving between shadows, trying to stay off the radar. Emma's mind was still whirling with the truth she had uncovered. Her father had been a pawn in a much larger game, manipulated by a corrupt officer deep within law enforcement. But even that revelation had felt too small compared to the horror that followed. The syndicate wasn't just an underground network of criminals, it was a machine that had reached its tendrils deep into the very heart of the government. The true mastermind wasn't just a powerful figure in the criminal world, it was someone within the very institutions that were meant to protect them all. David, though badly wounded, could still walk, still fight, but as they moved through the streets, he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. The burden of what he had done weighed heavily on him, but the weight of his guilt was nothing compared to what was ahead. The moment shifted, pulling them into the heart of the plan, the compound. Emma had found the location after hours of research, tracking the movements of the corrupted officer and the power players connected to the syndicate. They were heading into the lion's den, and every step felt like it could be their last. The compound was heavily guarded, an impenetrable fortress surrounded by high walls and armed security. But Emma wasn't going to let anything stop her now. She had come this far, there was no turning back. The real enemy was within those walls, and she wasn't about to let him get away. The night air was thick with tension as Emma and David approached the compound under the cover of darkness. Emma's movements were silent, calculated. Every step was precise, every breath controlled. They had one chance to get inside undetected, and she wasn't about to waste it. Emma's hand moved to the small device she had picked up earlier, a code breaker she had stolen from one of the mercenaries during their escape. She plugged it into the security panel near the gates, and with a soft click, the metal gates began to creak open. They slipped inside without a sound. As they crept through the compound's grounds, Emma's senses were on high alert. The trees were thick, offering cover, but she knew time was running out. They had to move quickly. Every guard they passed was a risk. Emma held her breath as they reached the entrance of the building, ducking into the shadows to avoid detection. Her eyes locked with her father's. He was still in pain, but there was something else in his eyes now. Determined. They were in this together, and if they were going down, they would go down fighting. The moment transitioned into an all-out assault as Emma kicked open the door to the compound's interior. Her heart pounded as she stepped into the well-lit hallways, the soft echo of their footsteps soon drowned out by the sound of heavy boots on the floor. Emma quickly surveyed the area. No guards in sight yet, but she knew that would change soon. Close," Emma whispered to her father, her voice low but firm. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, a wave of energy flooding her senses. They were close now. They were close to taking down the man who had manipulated her father's every move, the one who had orchestrated this entire operation from behind the scenes. The silence was broken suddenly by a burst of gunfire. A guard stepped out from behind a corner, his weapon aimed directly at them. But Emma was faster. She moved without thinking, her body a blur as she dove behind cover, pulling her father with her. The gunfire ricocheted off the walls, sending sparks flying, but Emma was already in motion. With a quick roll, she launched herself toward the guard, using his momentum against him. She twisted his arm, disarming him in a fluid, practiced motion. Before he could react, she drove her elbow into his chest, knocking the wind out of him as he crumpled to the floor. The firefight that followed was intense. The sound of gunshots filled the air as more guards poured into the hallway, weapons drawn. Emma didn't hesitate. She grabbed a handgun off one of the fallen mercenaries, her aim steady as she fired at the incoming attackers. One guard went down, then another. She moved fluidly, as if she were dancing through the chaos, dodging bullets, taking cover behind pillars, and striking when the moment was right. David, despite his injury, fought beside her with surprising ferocity. His instincts had kicked in, and for the first time since the courtroom, Emma saw the man she had once known. Strong, brave, and unwavering. Together they cleared the hall, taking down guards one by one. Emma's eyes were sharp, her movements graceful as she shot, ducked, and flipped her way through the firefight. Her father followed closely, using his remaining strength to disable enemies who tried to flank them. The teamwork between them was seamless, father and daughter, united in purpose. As they moved deeper into the compound, the intensity of the battle grew. Each corner they turned, each door they opened, brought them closer to the man who had orchestrated everything. And then, finally, they reached the office. The door stood before them, guarded by two more mercenaries. Without hesitation, Emma launched herself at them. She kicked one mercenary in the chest, sending him crashing against the wall, while David tackled the second, knocking him to the ground. Emma kicked open the door to the office, and there, sitting behind a massive desk, was the true mastermind, the corrupt police officer, the man who had pulled every string in this criminal game. He looked up, his calm demeanor faltering only for a moment before he smirked, realizing they had come for him. "Did you really think you could get away with this?" Emma asked, her voice cold, seething with the anger that had been building for so long. She was no longer the frightened daughter. She was the one in control, the one who would bring him to justice. The officer's smirk faded, and with a swift motion he reached for his gun. But before he could draw it, Emma was already in motion. She kicked his hand away, sending the weapon skidding across the floor. The moment shifted again as the final confrontation played out in real time. Emma and the officer clashed in a flurry of punches and kicks. She dodged his blows, her body moving with an almost supernatural speed as her father watched, his face a mix of pride and disbelief. Every strike Emma delivered was a message. This man had destroyed her family, had manipulated them, and now he was going to pay. With a final, devastating move, Emma took him down, her elbow driving into his neck, cutting off his air supply long enough for him to pass out. The man who had controlled her father's every move was now at their mercy. Together, father and daughter stood over the man, the fight finally over. Their teamwork had brought him down, and now the truth would finally be exposed. Emma's eyes met her father's, a silent understanding passing between them. This was the moment they had been fighting for. The syndicate would be exposed, and justice would be served. The aftermath of the brutal firefight echoed through the silence that followed. The compound was now a fortress of fallen enemies, their weapons scattered across the cold, concrete floors as Emma and her father made their way to the exit. Their breathing was heavy, the weight of the battle hanging in the air. But the job wasn't done. The corrupt police officer who had orchestrated the entire chain of events from the shadows was now under their control, bound and unconscious, ready to be taken into custody. But the true battle had always been more than physical. It had always been about exposing the truth, about bringing justice to a world that had been manipulated by power and deceit. And now, that justice was within reach. Cut to the next day. The courtroom was tense once again, but this time the atmosphere was different. Gone were the chaos and fear. In their place was a deep sense of resolution, as if the very air had been purified by the truth that had come to light, the truth that Emma had fought for, bled for, and risked everything to expose. The corrupt officer, now in handcuffs, stood in front of the judge. His face was pale, his eyes wild with fear, but the mask of invincibility he had worn for so long was shattered. The evidence was irrefutable. Emma and her father had worked together to bring the syndicate down, and the connections between the criminal empire and the highest levels of law enforcement had been laid bare. The truth was undeniable, and the jury knew it. The syndicate was dismantled, and every last one of its operatives was behind bars. The moment shifted again as Emma stood in the witness stand, her posture confident, her gaze unwavering. Her father standing next to her was a man forever changed by everything that had happened. The guilt of his past actions would never fully leave him, but in this moment he had redeemed himself. Not through his own actions, but through his willingness to fight for the truth, to stand by his daughter's side when it mattered most. Emma's voice rang out, steady and clear, as she made her closing statement. "My father made mistakes," she began, her words slow and deliberate, the weight of each syllable carrying the burden of the truth. "But in the end he helped me find the truth. He fought alongside me, not for his redemption, but for mine. He's not the man he used to be, and neither am I, but together we've learned what it means to stand for what's right, even when it's the hardest thing to do." The courtroom was silent, save for the quiet rustling of papers and the occasional shuffle of feet. The crowd, once divided, now seemed to understand. Emma's words had transcended the pain, the anger, and the betrayal. They had witnessed a father and daughter who, despite their past, had come together to right the wrongs that had been done. Emma stood tall, no longer the innocent child who had looked up to her father, but a young woman who had been forced to face a brutal reality. She had seen the darkness within her own family, had confronted the lies and the betrayals, and had emerged stronger for it. And in that moment, with the weight of the courtroom on her shoulders, she understood that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about redemption, about understanding the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The camera panned slowly over the courtroom, catching the solemn expressions of the jurors, the witnesses, the people who had watched the case unfold. They nodded, some with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of hard-won understanding. It was clear that justice had been served, but it had come at a cost. The emotional toll of the entire case was apparent in the faces of everyone present. They had borne witness to something far greater than a criminal trial. They had seen the unraveling of a life built on lies and the rebuilding of a life grounded in truth. In the corner of the courtroom, David Reeves stood silently, his hand resting on the chair beside him. He had seen his world crumble, his name tarnished beyond recognition, but in the end he had been part of something greater than himself. His actions had caused pain, yes, but they had also led to the destruction of a corrupt system, and he had helped expose it. The weight of his past still hung over him, but Emma had helped him find the one thing he had longed for most, a chance to make things right. As the judge banged his gavel, signaling the end of the case, Emma turned to her father, her gaze softening. Despite everything, despite the betrayals and the heartache, they had made it through. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice low but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Emma. I don't know what I would have done without you." Emma didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked ahead, her gaze fixed on the horizon of their future. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The battle was over, but the journey was far from finished. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Emma and her father stood in the same space, yet worlds apart from the people they had once been. But they had one thing that no one could take from them: the truth. And in that truth, they had found redemption. The camera lingered on Emma, her face calm but determined. The war had been fought, and though the scars of the past would never fully fade, she had emerged from it stronger. There was no more fear, no more hiding. She had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been a victim of the lies and the corruption that had held them all in its grip. The world was waiting, and now, Emma Reeve was ready to face it. As the courtroom doors closed behind Emma and her father, the weight of the trial seemed to lift, if only for a moment. The battle for the truth had been won, but both of them knew deep down that this victory, hard-won as it was, wasn't the end. The world they had uncovered, dark, twisted, and dangerous, had only just begun to unravel. And while they had taken down one powerful enemy, the very nature of their struggle hinted that there was far more to be discovered. The moment shifted, and the quiet peace of the aftermath was shattered by the soft hum of Emma's phone vibrating on the table. Her hand instinctively reached for it, the screen lighting up with a message from an unknown number. She frowned as she opened it, her fingers quickly scanning the cryptic text. "The truth you uncovered is only a fraction of the story. Someone close to you is still playing both sides. Be careful, they're watching." Emma's heart skipped a beat, a shiver running down her spine. The words were ominous, chilling in their simplicity, and they struck her with a terrifying realization. Despite everything they had uncovered, despite taking down the syndicate, the danger wasn't over. There was still someone within her circle, someone she trusted, who could be working for the very criminal network they had fought so hard to expose. Her hand gripped the phone tighter, as if the screen might give her answers that it wasn't willing to provide. "Who could it be?" she whispered to herself. She looked up at her father, who was pacing nearby, the exhaustion from their ordeal still heavy in his shoulders. She had thought they could finally rest, but this message made it clear. The fight was far from finished. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and Emma spun around, her heart racing. Her breath caught in her throat as she took a step forward, her eyes scanning the room. Was it just the wind? Or was someone else still out there, waiting in the shadows? A voice, cold, distant, and all too familiar, echoed in her mind. "This isn't over, Emma, not by a long shot." She took a deep breath, pushing the unease aside for the moment. This was the same fight, just a different face, a different enemy. She couldn't let herself be shaken. But the questions were now swirling in her head, louder than ever. Who's still involved in the syndicate? Who could working with them from the inside? And how? The moment transited as Emma moved toward the window, looking out over the city. The same city that had been a silent witness to the darkness of the syndicate. The same city that was now teeming with questions she hadn't even begun to answer. The shadows cast by the setting sun seemed to grow longer, stretching across the city as if they were reaching for her. A cold chill ran through her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Then, as she stood there, a soft knock echoed from the door behind her. She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the handle, her heart racing. She knew who it was before she even opened it. A figure stood on the other side, their face obscured, their presence heavy with something Emma couldn't quite place. "Emma," the figure said, their voice low, careful, and yet filled with an unmistakable sense of urgency. "It's not over. Someone in your life is still tied to the syndicate, and they'll stop at nothing to finish what they started." Her pulse quickened, a wave of dread washing over her. Could this be the same person who had sent the message? Or was it someone else? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her thoughts were racing too fast, too frantic. The figure stepped forward, their expression hidden beneath a mask but their intent clear. "You have to find out who it is, Emma," the voice said again, more forceful now, "before it's too late." The door slammed shut behind them as Emma stepped back, stunned by the cryptic warning. She stood alone in the room, 1,000 questions racing through her mind. Who was still out there, waiting to pull the strings? How deep did this conspiracy go? And then, just as quickly as the moment had arrived, it left. Emma's phone buzzed again, another message. Her fingers shook as she reached for it, her breath hitching in her chest. The truth was just the beginning. The real mastermind is still out there. Find them, or they will find you. The words were clear. The danger was far from over, and Emma knew that the fight ahead would be even more dangerous than anything she had already faced. As she looked at the phone, her thoughts went to her father, to the people she had come to trust, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that someone, somewhere, was still watching her every move. The truth was just the beginning. What happens when the real mastermind is still at large? Do you think Emma and her father can finally put this behind them? Or is the danger far from over? Comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for the next action-packed chapter.